To understand what life was like for a soldier during the Hundred Years' War, we first need to know who these men actually were. Unlike today's professional armies, medieval forces mixed together people from all levels of society, each with completely different experiences and reasons for fighting. Picture a typical English army getting ready to sail for France in the 1340s. Standing on the deck of a creaking wooden ship, we'd see a slice of medieval society crammed into a space barely big enough to hold them all. There's an earl in his silk coat, trying to look dignified while being seasick over the rail. Next to him stands a farmer from Kent, clutching his longbow and staring at the ocean with wide eyes. He's never seen so much water in his life. In the corner, a group of Welsh spearmen talk in their own language, their mountain accents carrying over the noise. Scattered throughout are the professionals, sergeants who've fought in a dozen campaigns, crossbowmen from other countries, and hard-faced soldiers whose scars tell stories of battles from Scotland to southern France. Let's start with perhaps the most famous soldiers of this war, the English longbowmen. These men weren't professional soldiers like we think of today. Most were farmers, craftsmen, or laborers who had been practicing archery since they were children. Not because they wanted to, but because the law said they had to. In 1363, King Edward III made it mandatory for all Englishmen to practice archery on Sundays after church. Instead of relaxing on their day off, men had to spend hours shooting arrows at targets in the village commons. Parents complained, young men grumbled. But this law created something that had never existed before in medieval Europe: a huge pool of skilled archers ready to fight at a moment's notice. These men could draw bows that required 150 to 180 pounds of force. To put that in perspective, most modern hunting bows need only 40 to 60 pounds of force. A medieval war bow was so powerful that it literally changed the archer's body. Evidence from the Mary Rose, a Tudor warship that sank in 1545, shows that longbowmen developed bent spines, enlarged left arms, and special bone formations from a lifetime of drawing these massive weapons. Anyone could spot a veteran archer just by looking at how he stood and moved. But raw strength wasn't enough. A skilled longbowman could shoot 12 arrows per minute. That's one arrow every 5 seconds, aimed accurately at targets up to 250 yards away. They practiced shooting at wooden targets shaped like knights, learning to hit the weak spots in armor where an arrow could get through. These men weren't just archers. They were precision killers trained to take down the elite warriors of their time. On the French side stood the flower of medieval knighthood, heavily armored warriors who had trained for combat since boyhood. These men represented the peak of medieval military technology and social status. A single knight's equipment could cost as much as a small village earned in an entire year. His war horse, the massive destrier, bred specifically for battle, was worth more than most peasants would see in their whole lives. But here's something fascinating that most people don't understand. Many of these French knights weren't actually French in any way we'd recognize today. The idea of nationalism simply didn't exist in medieval Europe. A knight from Gascony might fight for England one year and France the next, depending on where his feudal loyalties lay or who offered better pay. The Count of Foix could be allied with England, while his neighbor, the Count of Armagnac, served France. Identity was based on personal loyalty, family honor, and feudal ties, not on anything like modern patriotism. These knights weren't just warriors. They were the social and economic elite of their time. They owned vast estates, controlled the lives of thousands of peasants, and saw warfare as both their duty and their right. Many had been raised in other noble households as children, learning not just swordplay and horsemanship, but the complex web of relationships that held medieval society together. They spoke multiple languages, understood politics and diplomacy, and saw themselves as the heirs of legendary figures like Charlemagne and King Arthur. The backbone of both armies consisted of foot soldiers, spearmen, crossbowmen, and various support troops. These men came from every corner of medieval life, and their stories were as different as their backgrounds. Some were volunteers drawn by tales of adventure and the riches to be won in French towns and cities. Others were pressed into service through systems that were essentially medieval conscription, where local officials would round up able-bodied men from villages and towns. Among these foot soldiers were specialists whose skills were crucial to medieval warfare. The Welsh spearmen, for instance, came from a warrior culture where every man was expected to know how to fight. They carried long spears and wore little armor, relying on speed and fierceness rather than protection. These men had been fighting English armies for generations before joining them, and they brought hard-won experience of mountain warfare and hit-and-run tactics. Then there were the crossbowmen, some English, but many foreign mercenaries who followed the armies for pay. These men operated weapons that could punch through the finest armor, but which took time and skill to reload. They were often protected by large shields called pavises, behind which they could crouch while preparing their weapons for the next shot. Unlike longbowmen, crossbowmen could be trained relatively quickly, but they couldn't shoot nearly as fast. The mercenaries were the closest thing to professional soldiers of their time. Companies like the White Company, led by John Hawkwood, or the Great Company of Bertrand du Guesclin, were essentially medieval military corporations. These men fought for whoever paid them best, and they were often the most experienced and effective soldiers on the battlefield. They had their own codes of conduct, their own loyalties, and their own brutal efficiency. The most feared were the Genoese crossbowmen, who served both sides at different times during the war. These men were specialists not just in crossbow warfare, but in siege operations. They understood how to take fortified positions, could operate the great siege engines, and knew how to dig tunnels under castle walls. When a Genoese crossbowman aimed at someone, that person knew they were facing a man who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. But how did ordinary men become soldiers? The process was often harsh and chaotic, showing the brutal realities of medieval life. Village officials would receive orders from their lord or the king to provide a certain number of men for military service. Sometimes they'd hold a lottery, with names drawn from a hat. Other times, the poorest men would be chosen, or wealthy neighbors would pay them to go in their place. Imagine being a blacksmith's apprentice in Yorkshire. One day, someone's shoeing horses and mending farm tools, learning a trade that will provide food for life. The next day, there's a commotion in the village square. The local bailiff has arrived with armed men in a royal order. They need 20 men for the king's army. There's no basic training, no military handbook, no gradual introduction to warfare. Someone gets handed a spear, told to report to the gathering point, and given the helpful advice to try not to die. For many young men, military service offered opportunities that their civilian lives never could. A successful campaign could provide enough loot to buy land, start a business, or marry someone from a higher social class. Stories spread of common soldiers who had become wealthy through war, who had returned home to buy manor houses and marry knights' daughters. These tales, often exaggerated, were powerful motivators for men whose civilian prospects were limited to a lifetime of hard labor and early death. But military service also meant leaving behind everything familiar. Most of these men had never traveled more than a day's walk from their birthplace. They spoke only their local dialect, knew only their local customs, and had never seen the ocean, let alone crossed it. Being forced into service meant not just risking death in battle, but facing a world larger and more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. The social tensions within these armies were constant and complex. Knights looked down on foot soldiers as social inferiors, yet depended on them for victory. Foot soldiers resented the knights' privileges and wealth, yet knew that noble favor could make the difference between survival and death. English and Welsh soldiers fought side by side despite generations of mutual hatred. French prisoners were treated with honor if they were noble, but common soldiers could expect no mercy. These tensions were managed through a combination of harsh discipline, shared hardship, and the promise of loot. A successful campaign could unite men across class lines for a while, but the underlying social divisions never disappeared, and they shaped every aspect of military life, from who got the best food to who received medical attention when wounded. Let's talk about what these soldiers actually carried into battle, because the equipment varied dramatically depending on your social status, role, and most importantly, how much money you or your lord could afford to spend on keeping you alive. An English longbowman's kit was deceptively simple but devastatingly effective. His primary weapon was the longbow itself, 6 feet of seasoned yew wood that had been carefully shaped and tillered by skilled bowyers. But not just any yew would do. The best bows were made from wood that grew slowly in mountainous regions, where the harsh conditions created dense, strong grain. A single bow might represent weeks of skilled labor, and losing it could end an archer's effectiveness as a soldier. The bowyer would select a stave where the heartwood and sapwood met naturally, creating a bow that was strong in compression on one side and flexible in tension on the other. This wasn't just craftsmanship, it was engineering that wouldn't be fully understood until centuries later. The finished bow could propel a cloth-yard arrow with enough force to penetrate mail at 200 yards and could kill an unarmored man at twice that distance. The arrows themselves were precious commodities, each one handcrafted by skilled fletchers. A bodkin point, the armor-piercing arrowhead preferred for war, was forged from high-quality steel and could cost as much as a day's wages for a common laborer. The shaft was made from ash or birch, carefully selected for straightness and strength. The fletching used goose feathers, cut and shaped to give the arrow stability in flight. Each arrow represented a significant investment, and losing them meant losing your ability to fight effectively. An archer would typically carry 24 to 30 arrows into battle, stored in a leather bag or simple quiver. But the real professionals carried more, sometimes 60 arrows or more, knowing that battles could be won or lost based on who could keep shooting the longest. During the Siege of Harfleur, English archers shot an estimated 500,000 arrows in a single day. That's roughly 1,000 arrows per archer, a staggering amount of firepower that required enormous logistical preparation. For protection, most longbowmen wore what was called a jack, a padded jacket sometimes reinforced with small metal plates or pieces of horn. This wasn't much protection against a direct sword thrust, but it could stop glancing blows and arrows that had lost their energy. The padding was typically stuffed with old rags, straw, or sometimes even torn-up manuscripts, anything that could absorb impact. Over time, these jacks became stiff with dried sweat, blood, and mud, creating a kind of crude armor that was better than nothing but far from comfortable. On their heads, they wore simple iron caps called sallets, or kettle hats. These provided some protection against overhead strikes and debris, but left the face exposed. An archer needed to be able to see clearly to aim, and any helmet that restricted vision was worse than useless. Some archers went bareheaded, preferring the risk of head wounds to the impediment of wearing a helmet. But the longbowman's most important piece of equipment was his bodkin, a long dagger carried at his side. When enemy cavalry or infantry closed to hand-to-hand range, the bow became useless, and archers had to defend themselves with whatever weapons they could manage. The bodkin was designed to slip between armor plates or punch through mail links. It wasn't much against a fully armored knight, but it could kill a lightly armored foot soldier efficiently. A fully equipped knight, by contrast, was like a medieval tank, a mobile fortress bristling with weapons and protected by the finest armor that money could buy. His armor alone could weigh 50 to 60 pounds, though contrary to popular belief, he could still move quite freely. The armor was so well balanced and articulated that a knight could mount his horse unassisted, run short distances, and even do acrobatic feats while fully armored. The idea that knights were slow, clumsy, or helpless when unhorsed is a myth. They were actually remarkably agile fighters. The knight's primary weapons included a lance for mounted combat, a 12-foot shaft of ash tipped with a steel point designed to concentrate all the force of a charging horse into a single devastating thrust. For close fighting, he carried a sword. Not just any sword, but a precisely balanced weapon that might have been passed down through generations of his family. These swords were often given names and were considered almost alive by their owners. But swords weren't always the most effective weapons against heavily armored opponents. Many knights also carried war hammers, maces, or poleaxes, weapons designed specifically to deal with plate armor. A war hammer could dent armor badly enough to trap the wearer's limbs, while a mace could deliver crushing blows that could kill through armor by sheer force of impact. What movies and popular culture get completely wrong is the maintenance required for all this equipment. A knight's gear was a full-time responsibility that required a small army of servants and specialists. His destrier, the massive war horse bred specifically for war, needed constant care, specialized feed, and regular training. These horses were incredibly valuable, often worth more than a knight's annual income, and losing one could end a military career. The knight traveled with pages to care for his horses, squires to maintain his armor and weapons, and servants to cook his food, wash his clothes, and set up his pavilion each night. A single knight might require a dozen support staff, all of whom needed to be fed, equipped, and transported. This made cavalry forces incredibly expensive to maintain, but also incredibly effective when properly deployed. The average foot soldier had much simpler equipment, but even this basic gear represented a significant investment for a man whose entire worldly wealth might amount to a few shillings. His primary weapon was usually a spear or pike. Cheap to make, easy to learn, and devastatingly effective when used in formation. A good spear point was forged steel, but many foot soldiers made do with fire-hardened wood or crude iron points that might break on first impact. Some foot soldiers carried swords, but these were often of poor quality, soft iron that wouldn't hold an edge, or steel so brittle it might shatter in combat. More common were simple tools adapted for war, hammers, axes, even sharpened farm implements. A billhook used for trimming hedges could split a skull just as effectively as a purpose-made weapon. For protection, the typical foot soldier might have a padded jacket similar to an archer's jack, perhaps reinforced with bits of metal or leather. A simple helmet was a luxury that many couldn't afford. Most made do with thick cloth caps or leather hoods that provided minimal protection, but were better than nothing. Most importantly, every soldier carried his eating bowl, a water container, and perhaps a small bag of personal possessions. These might seem trivial compared to weapons and armor, but they were essential for survival on campaign. A soldier without his eating bowl might starve even when food was available, simply because he had no way to carry his ration from the cooking pot to a place where he could eat it. Food and logistics were the foundation that made medieval warfare possible, though they're often the most overlooked aspects of military history. An army, as Napoleon would later observe, marches on its stomach, and this was just as true in the 14th century as it would be in the 19th. A soldier's typical ration consisted of hard biscuits called hardtack, twice-baked bread that was nearly indestructible but required strong teeth, and a lot of saliva to make edible. Salted pork or beef provided protein, though the meat was often so heavily salted that it had to be soaked in water before it could be eaten. Cheese, when available, was another source of protein and fat. And always ale or wine, partly for the calories, partly because fermented beverages were safer than water from unknown sources. Fresh food was a luxury obtained through foraging, purchased from local markets, or organized raiding. Soldiers learned to recognize edible plants, to identify which berries were safe to eat, and to catch fish from streams and rivers. Those with hunting skills could supplement the army's diet with game, though this required time and energy that might be needed for other tasks. Water was often more dangerous than wine, and medieval armies knew it. Bad water could kill more soldiers than enemy swords, so commanders preferred to supply their troops with fermented beverages when possible. A soldier might drink several pints of weak ale per day without being considered drunk. It was simply safer than risking contaminated water. The process of getting an army from England to France was a logistical nightmare that required months of preparation and enormous resources. Ships had to be commandeered from merchants, often against their will, and with promises of compensation that might never be paid. These weren't purpose-built military vessels. They were converted merchant ships, fishing boats, and anything else that could float and carry men and equipment. The English used ships called cogs, broad, flat-bottomed vessels that could carry both men and horses, but were notoriously uncomfortable and unstable. A typical cog might carry 30 to 40 soldiers along with their equipment and supplies, packed together in conditions that would horrify modern observers. Sanitation was non-existent, privacy was impossible, and seasickness was epidemic. Horses presented special problems. Destriers and other war horses had to be transported in specially constructed stalls that held them upright during the crossing. Many horses died during transport, either from the stress of the journey or from injuries sustained when ships pitched and rolled in rough seas. The loss of horses could cripple a military campaign before it even began. Once in France, armies moved slowly and ponderously across the countryside, A typical day's march might cover 10 to 15 miles on good roads and fair weather. Bad weather could reduce this to almost nothing, and poor roads could make travel impossible for heavily loaded supply wagons. Soldiers marched in long columns that might stretch for miles, with scouts ahead to watch for enemies and flankers protecting the sides of the main body. The noise of a medieval army on the march was tremendous. Thousands of men talking, laughing, and complaining, hundreds of horses neighing and stamping, wagon wheels creaking and groaning under their loads. Steel clanked against steel, leather creaked, and over it all was the steady rhythm of thousands of feet hitting the ground in rough unison. You could hear an army coming from miles away, which made surprise attacks almost impossible, but also served to intimidate enemies and local populations. When not fighting, soldiers spent most of their time in temporary camps. These weren't the organized military bases you might imagine from movies. Medieval camps were chaotic, smelly, and dangerous places. When an army stopped for the night, it was organized chaos. The commander would choose a defensible position, preferably near water and with good visibility. Then came the work: digging latrines, setting up tents for those who had them, gathering firewood, and establishing guard rotations. Most common soldiers didn't have tents. They slept under the stars, or if they were lucky, they might share a simple canvas shelter with several other men. Only knights and officers had proper pavilions. Cooking was done over open fires, with soldiers organized into small groups called messes, usually 6 to 10 men, who pooled their rations and took turns cooking. The food was basic but filling: porridge made from oats or barley, stews with whatever meat was available, and always bread when they could get it. Ale or wine wasn't just for pleasure, it was safer than water and provided calories that hard-working soldiers needed. A typical soldier might drink several pints per day without being considered drunk. Personal hygiene was a constant challenge. Soldiers might go weeks without a proper bath. They washed in streams when possible, but often had to make do with wiping down with cloth. Lice were universal. Dysentery was common. Infected wounds were often fatal. Medieval armies had surgeons, but their knowledge was limited. Many soldiers carried basic medical supplies: strips of cloth for bandages, perhaps some herbs believed to have healing properties. Despite the hardships, soldiers found ways to entertain themselves. Dice games were enormously popular and often led to fights when men suspected cheating. Wrestling matches, storytelling, and singing helped pass the time. Music was important for morale. Each company might have someone who could play a simple instrument. Songs from home helped soldiers remember what they were fighting for, or at least what they hoped to return to. Medieval soldiers were deeply religious, but in a very practical way. They carried religious medallions and relics not just for spiritual comfort, but because they genuinely believed these items could protect them in battle. Before major battles, priests would hold mass and give general absolution, essentially forgiving all sins in advance, since many soldiers wouldn't survive to confess individually. But soldiers also embraced superstitions that the church might not approve of. Lucky charms, specific rituals before battle, and beliefs about omens were universal. Military discipline was harsh but often inconsistent. Desertion was theoretically punishable by death, but commanders often overlooked it if the soldier was valuable or if too many men were already deserting. More common punishments included flogging, reduction in pay, or assignment to dangerous duties. Knights were generally held to different standards than common soldiers. Their social status provided some protection from the worst punishments. For many soldiers, war was an economic opportunity. Pay was irregular but potentially generous. An English longbowman might earn 6 pence per day, more than many made as farmers. Knights received much more, sometimes hundreds of pounds for a campaign. But the real money was in loot. After a successful battle or siege, armies would sack the defeated area. Soldiers could keep whatever they could carry, leading to some remarkable fortunes. Some longbowmen returned from France wealthy enough to buy land and become minor gentry. Most soldiers were illiterate, but they found ways to send messages home. Scribes in the army would write letters for soldiers, or they might send word through merchants or other travelers heading back to England. These letters reveal the human side of medieval warfare. Soldiers wrote about missing their families, about the strange customs they encountered in France, about hoping to return home soon. Many of these letters never arrived. The men who wrote them died before the messengers could deliver them. The night before a major battle was often sleepless for soldiers. Some prayed, others wrote what they thought might be their final letters home. Many simply sat in silence, contemplating what the next day might bring. Battle days typically started before dawn. Soldiers would eat what might be their last meal, often just bread and ale. They'd check their equipment one final time, help each other with armor straps, and form up in their assigned positions. Let's follow our English longbowmen into the Battle of Crécy in 1346. You're positioned on a slight hill with thousands of other archers. In front of you, wooden stakes have been driven into the ground to break up cavalry charges. As the French army approaches, you can see the sun glinting off their armor. There are thousands of them, knights, crossbowmen, and foot soldiers. Your hands are sweating despite the cool morning air. The order comes, draw! You pull your bowstring back to your ear, a motion you've practiced thousands of times. The arrow knocks against the string, its steel point gleaming. Loose! Thousands of arrows rise into the air like a deadly cloud. For a moment, they block out the sun. Then they begin their descent toward the French lines. What movies rarely show accurately is the devastating psychological effect of massed archery. Imagine thousands of arrows falling around you like deadly rain. Even if you're not hit, the sound is terrifying. Arrows whistling through the air, striking armor, hitting the ground with metallic clangs. Horses were particularly vulnerable. A war horse struck by arrows would panic, throwing its rider and disrupting formations. This chaos was often more valuable than the actual casualties caused by the arrows. But battles weren't won by archery alone. Eventually, lines would close, and hand-to-hand combat would begin. This is where movies get almost everything wrong. Real medieval combat was exhausting, and often over quickly for individual participants. A sword fight lasting minutes would leave both fighters completely exhausted. Most combat was decided in seconds. A thrust that found a gap in armor, a mace blow that cracked a skull, a spear point that pierced a chest. For a heavily armored knight, battle was a different experience entirely. Your vision was limited by your helmet's visor. Hearing was muffled. The weight of armor made every movement deliberate. But you were also much more survivable than lighter-armed troops. Good armor could turn aside most weapon strikes. Knights were valuable prisoners, so enemies might try to capture rather than kill you. The psychological pressure was different too. As a knight, you were expected to show courage, to lead from the front. Cowardice would destroy your reputation and social standing. What strikes modern readers is how chaotic medieval battles were. There were no radios, no instant communication. Once fighting began, commanders often had little control over what happened. Units would advance, engage, and either break or push forward based on local conditions. A single event, the death of a prominent leader, the arrival of unexpected reinforcements, a rumor that spread through the ranks, could completely change the battle's outcome. Medieval battles produced horrific casualties. Without modern medical knowledge, wounds that would be treatable today were often fatal. A simple cut could become infected and kill a soldier weeks later. The battlefield after combat was a nightmare of dying men and horses. Soldiers would move through the field, finishing off enemy wounded. Mercy killings were common. Leaving someone to die slowly was considered cruel, and looking for valuable equipment or prisoners. If you survived a major battle, you'd likely remember it for the rest of your life. The sounds, smells, and sights would haunt your dreams, but you'd also feel an incredible bond with your fellow survivors. Veterans of famous battles like Crécy, Poitiers, or Agincourt carried their service as a badge of honor. These men had been tested in the ultimate trial and emerged victorious. While famous battles like Agincourt capture our imagination, the reality is that soldiers spent far more time in sieges than in pitched battles. And sieges were often deadlier than battles. When an army approached a fortified city or castle, they faced a choice: assault immediately, try to starve the defenders out, or attempt to breach the walls through mining or artillery. Each option had terrible costs for the soldiers involved. Direct assaults were incredibly dangerous for attackers. Soldiers had to approach walls under a rain of arrows, crossbow bolts, and various projectiles. Defenders would drop stones, pour boiling oil, or throw quicklime from the walls. Scaling ladders were death traps. The first soldiers up faced almost certain death, but military custom demanded that someone had to go first. Often these were volunteers seeking glory or wealth, or men who had drawn lots. For soldiers conducting a siege, life was often worse than for the defenders. They were living in temporary camps, often without adequate food or clean water. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. The Siege of Calais in 1346 to 1347 lasted 11 months. English soldiers lived in muddy camps outside the city walls, suffering through a harsh winter. Many died of disease rather than enemy action. One of the most terrifying aspects of siege warfare was underground mining. Engineers would dig tunnels under castle walls, then collapse them to create breaches. But defenders might dig countermines to intercept the attackers. Underground fights in these narrow tunnels were claustrophobic nightmares. Soldiers fought by torchlight in spaces barely wide enough for one man, with cave-ins threatening to bury everyone alive. By the later stages of the Hundred Years' War, gunpowder weapons were becoming common. Early cannons were dangerous to their operators as well as their targets. They had a tendency to explode. Soldiers operating these weapons needed new skills and faced new dangers. Gunpowder was expensive and had to be kept dry. A single spark could ignite an entire supply, killing everyone nearby. The end of a siege could be wonderful or terrible for the soldiers involved. If the city surrendered, they might be allowed to march out with honor. But if the city was taken by storm after a long resistance, medieval law allowed the attackers to sack it completely. This meant soldiers could legally loot everything of value, and civilians had no protection. Some soldiers became wealthy from successful sieges, but the experience often traumatized them for life. Not all soldiers died in battle. Many served multiple campaigns and eventually returned home. But the men who came back were often very different from those who had left. Medieval warfare left its mark on survivors. Archaeological studies of medieval cemeteries show evidence of healed sword cuts, arrow wounds, and broken bones. Many veterans walked with limps or had limited use of arms damaged in combat. The longbowmen we mentioned earlier developed characteristic skeletal deformities from years of drawing heavy bows. These men were marked for life by their service. We don't have medieval terms for what we now call PTSD, but the symptoms were clearly recognized. Veterans who jumped at sudden sounds, who couldn't sleep peacefully, who drank heavily to forget what they'd seen. These were common figures in medieval society. Some veterans found purpose in sharing their stories. They'd become local celebrities, entertaining tavern crowds with tales of famous battles. Others withdrew from society, unable to readjust to peaceful life. Successful soldiers could return home wealthy. Some longbowmen used their earnings to buy land and establish themselves as minor gentry. Others invested in trade or crafts. But many soldiers returned with nothing. Pay was often irregular, and soldiers might spend years campaigning without receiving what they were owed. Some returned home poorer than when they left. Medieval society had mixed feelings about veterans. They were respected for their service and feared for their experience with violence. Many found work as guards, watchmen, or in other roles where their military experience was valuable. Others struggled to find their place. A man who'd spent years as a professional soldier might find it difficult to return to farming or craftsmanship. By the end of the Hundred Years' War, military technology and tactics were changing rapidly. The heavily armored knight was becoming obsolete, replaced by professional infantry and gunpowder weapons. Veterans of the early campaigns found themselves in a world where their skills were no longer as valuable. The military revolution was making their type of warfare obsolete. The soldiers of the Hundred Years' War left behind more than just their weapons and armor. They changed European society permanently. The success of common soldiers, longbowmen and foot soldiers, against noble knights helped break down social hierarchies. English victories created a sense of national identity that hadn't existed before. French defeats led to military reforms and eventually to their own national awakening. The life of a soldier during the Hundred Years' War was brutal, uncertain, and often short. These men faced dangers we can barely imagine, from disease and starvation to the terror of medieval combat. But they were also part of something larger than themselves. They participated in events that shaped the modern world. The tactics they developed, the social changes their service accelerated, and the national identities their sacrifices helped create all echo down to our time. When we remember the Hundred Years' War, we often focus on famous battles and great leaders, but it was the common soldiers, the longbowmen, the foot soldiers, the siege engineers, who actually fought and won this conflict. Their courage, their suffering, and their determination remind us that history is made not just by kings and generals, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. The next time you hear about Agincourt or Crécy, remember that behind those famous names were thousands of individual stories, young men far from home, fighting for causes they might not fully understand, but facing that fight with whatever courage they could muster. That's the real story of the Hundred Years' War, not just the clash of nations, but the triumph and tragedy of the human spirit under the worst possible conditions.